You know that feeling, right? When the lights just suddenly cut out.
Yeah.
It's pretty unsettling.
Oh, definitely.
1 second you're fine, familiar surroundings, the next,
Yeah.
just boom, darkness,
Hmm.
disorienting.
Yeah, it hits something deep, that kind of vulnerability.
Exactly. And it's that kind of stark contrast.
Yeah.
Light versus dark, feeling safe versus completely helpless, that we're actually going to dig into today with some fascinating texts.
Precisely. Yeah, we're diving into some excerpts from Judgments and Deliverance in Egypt.
Okay.
And these aren't like dry historical records, they're really vivid stories. They describe divine intervention in, well, two really powerful ways.
Right.
First, this intense darkness falling over the Egyptians while at the same time the Israelites have light.
Wow. Okay.
And second, the tragic death of the Egyptian firstborn, which, again, the Israelites were spared from.
So starkly different experiences.
Dramatically different. Think of it as like a historical account zeroing in on these contrasting fates.
Gotcha. So we've got these specific passages that lay all this out. And our mission for this deep dive is really to get into the details, right? Understand these events as the text presents them.
Yeah, explore that huge difference in experience and maybe, see what the underlying point is. What are the potential takeaways from these old accounts?
Okay, sounds good. So where should we start? That darkness sounds incredibly powerful. Let's unpack that first.
Okay, so the text, it paints this picture of the darkness, and it's like really vivid.
How so?
Well, it wasn't just, the absence of light. It was described as something palpable, almost thick, so dense that fire couldn't light it up. Even the stars were useless.
Well,
And the psychological side is huge here. It talks about the Egyptians being, shackled with darkness, basically trapped, right? And just gripped by fear in their own homes.
trapped in the dark.
Yeah, and there's this phrase, exiles from the eternal providence, which suggests this profound feeling of being like cut off, abandoned, maybe.
That's heavy. So it's more than just not being able to see.
Much more. And beyond just the dramatic picture, a key insight seems to be how the text links their actions to these consequences. It suggests their past oppression of the Israelites is why this is happening.
Oh, okay. So there's a cause and effect element presented.
Yeah.
You can almost feel that claustrophobia, just
Mhm.
being stuck like that.
Yeah.
And it wasn't just the dark itself, was it? There was this fear of other things.
Right, exactly. And the text mentions they were terrified of, like apparitions and weird
Oh,
sound.
yeah, those mute phantoms. That sounds creepy.
Totally. Mute phantoms with somber looks, it says. Even their inner rooms, their safest places, offered no escape.
So nowhere felt safe.
Nowhere. And here's where it gets really interesting. Like you said, the complete failure of their own stuff. Their magic, their knowledge.
It didn't work.
Nope. The text really emphasizes how useless Egyptian magic and, their famous shrewdness were against this. Their usual ways of dealing with fear just failed,
Leading to what?
leading to what's called ridiculous fear. They were apparently terrified of, like bugs and snakes, things they normally wouldn't fear.
Wow. So it sort of broke down their usual coping mechanisms.
Exactly. And what's fascinating there, I think, is how the text seems to be saying, look, human power, human cleverness, it has limits, especially when faced with something seen as coming from, well, a higher power.
And it even talks about fear itself, right? It gives this insight. What was it? Fear is not but the surrender of the helps that come from reason.
Yeah, that's the line.
So the idea is that uncertainty makes it worse.
Mm-hmm.
The less you understand why you're suffering, the more terrifying it becomes.
That seems to be the idea. Like the not knowing is maybe even scarier than a known danger.
Makes sense. Okay, so that's the Egyptian side. Pitch black. Terrifying.
Yeah.
What about the Israelites during all this?
Well, the text draws a super clear line. It says, basically, the whole world shone with brilliant light.
The whole world.
Well, everywhere except where the Egyptians were. That's the implication. And it wasn't just like a little bit of light. It was bright, pervasive.
So side by side, darkness and light.
Exactly. And it brings up that point you mentioned earlier. Is there a connection being made to the imperishable light of the law? The idea that the Israelites had this role, this purpose, and maybe the Egyptians were hindering it. The text seems to hint at that.
That's a really important layer. I mean, just picture it. Total darkness for one group, bright light for the other, happening at the same time.
It's a powerful image.
And the text even says the Egyptians could hear the Israelites but not see them.
Yeah. Which led them apparently to call the Israelites blessed because, well, they weren't suffering the same way.
So it emphasizes their own helplessness, maybe,
Yeah.
and makes them realize something's fundamentally different here.
I think so. It certainly seems to suggest a growing awareness on their part that something unusual was happening and it wasn't in their favor.
And what's also interesting is that the Israelites, even though they'd mistreated, they didn't take advantage of the situation. They didn't attack the Egyptians in the dark.
Right. The text makes that clear. They didn't harm them. And this apparently led the Egyptians to actually plead with them for help, because of the difference between them.
So they recognized the Israelites were somehow protected or favored.
It suggests that, yeah, a recognition of a power operating that wasn't their own and that seemed to be helping the Israelites.
And then there's the guidance aspect for the Israelites, this flaming pillar.
A flaming pillar for the dark paths and a mild sun for their journey.
Yeah.
It's this constant visual contrast, isn't it? Guidance, clarity for one group.
And being trapped in the dark for the other.
Exactly. So connecting back, like you said, the text really frames the Egyptians losing light as a direct consequence of how they treated the Israelites, how they'd kept your children confined. Poetic justice, almost.
Okay, wow. That darkness versus light imagery is incredibly potent. So that's one major event. Let's move on to the second one you mentioned. The death of the firstborn.
Right, the second major example. The death of the Egyptian firstborn, and again, the sparing of the Israelites.
And the text connects this back to something earlier too, right?
It does. It presents this as sort of the ultimate consequence of that horrific decision the Egyptians made earlier, remember? The plan to kill the infants of the holy ones, the Israelites.
Oh, right.
And the fact that one baby, Moses, was saved back then. The text portrays that survival as like a warning, a foreshadowing, a reproof for what they did.
So it's framing these events very deliberately, not random tragedy,
But as a response, a consequence tied directly to past injustice, according to this specific view of, well, divine justice.
Okay. So the text is drawing that line very clearly. Past actions leading to present tragedy. And it mentions this happening in the mighty water. Is that significant?
It seems to be. It definitely echoes how Moses himself was saved from the water. So you have this recurring theme, water as danger, but also water as a place of salvation or deliverance, depending on who you are in the story. It's powerful symbolism.
Yeah, it really is.
And the text also says that the Israelites' ancestors somehow knew this was coming.
Knew about the plague.
Well, maybe not the exact specifics, but that something significant, some kind of deliverance or judgment was foreknown. This knowledge, based on promises or oaths they believed in, gave the current generation courage.
So it wasn't a total shock to them in a way. They had a framework for understanding it.
It suggests they did, yeah. A sense of a bigger plan unfolding, something passed down through generations.
Okay. So while this terrible thing is happening to the Egyptians, what are the Israelites doing? How does the text describe their experience that night?
It paints a picture of community and faith. They're described as being together, offering sacrifice, following divine instructions with one mind, right? Sharing blessings, sharing dangers too, and even singing these ancestral hymns. So it's this image of shared purpose and deep faith, even on what must have been a pretty scary night for them too, you imagine.
Definitely. And that unity, that singing, how does that contrast with the Egyptians?
Well, the text contrasts it sharply with the sounds from the Egyptian side. A discordant cry, a piteous wail of mourning for children, just grief and chaos.
And it wasn't just one class of people affected, right?
No, the text really stresses the universality of it for the Egyptians. Slave was smitten with the same retribution as the master. The commoner suffered the same as the king. Everyone lost their firstborn.
That scale is just immense.
It underscores the sheer magnitude of it. The text talks about countless dead, so many that there weren't enough living people left to bury them properly.
Just an absolute devastating scene. Horrific.
Truly, and it's fascinating. The text claims that even the Egyptians who had previously been skeptical, maybe blaming things on sorcery.
Yeah.
When this happened, the death of the firstborn, that's when they finally acknowledged this people was God's son.
So that event was the breaking point for their disbelief. It was too big, too specific to explain away.
That's what the text suggests, yes. That its impact was so undeniable, it shattered their previous explanations.
And how does the text describe the agent of this destruction?
It uses this striking language. It talks about the all-powerful word coming down from heaven like a fierce warrior into the land right in the middle of the night, bringing death.
A warrior. Wow.
Yeah. And it adds these almost supernatural details to visions, unexpected terrors hitting the Egyptians while they slept.
So adding to the fear and chaos.
Exactly. But interestingly, the text also mentions that death, or the trial of death, did touch the Israelites too,
Oh,
with a plague that broke out among them later in the desert. So it wasn't like they were completely immune to hardship or divine anger.
okay. That's an important nuance.
But according to the text, that anger towards the Israelites was short-lived. It was stopped by the intervention of a blameless man, probably Moses or maybe Aaron, who stepped in with prayer and incense, reminding God, essentially, of the promises made to their ancestors, the covenants.
So intercession works for them.
It did. And this figure, this intercessor, is described very symbolically, his robe representing the whole world, ancestral glories on the stones he wore, God's grandeur on his crown.
Very symbolic.
Highly. And the text says point blank, the destroyer yielded to this figure. It really emphasizes the power of prayer, of remembering those divine promises within their narrative,
Which is a stark contrast, again, to the Egyptians.
where the merciless wrath, as the text calls it, just continued.
It really paints these two incredibly different paths unfolding side by side.
Absolutely. One of, let's say, divine protection and intervention, even with bumps along the road for the Israelites, and one of seemingly relentless judgment for the Egyptians.
And then, even after all that, the Egyptians changed their minds again about letting the Israelites go.
They do. The text describes them regretting it after they'd agreed and then deciding to chase after them. It's like this cycle of resistance, consequence, brief yielding, then more resistance.
Almost self-destructive.
The text calls it a compulsion appropriate to this ending, as if they were driven to forget their massive losses and pursue the Israelites anyway, setting up the final act.
Right, the Red Sea.
Exactly. And again, the text draws that sharp contrast. The Egyptians face an extraordinary death in the sea.
While the Israelites experience a glorious journey.
Precisely. And that journey is just filled with miracles, according to the text. Creation itself seems to bend to help them.
Like the sea parting.
Yeah, the sea parting to make dry land described as an unimpeded road and a grassy plain right through the water. Plus the cloud guiding and protecting them. It's a total suspension of normal reality to ensure their escape.
This amazing imagery.
And the Israelites walk through, they see these stupendous wonders, and they're praising their deliverer.
And there were other miracles too, right?
Yeah.
During their journey.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. The text lists specific examples, like the land producing gnats instead of the usual young animals, the river suddenly swarming with frogs instead of fish.
Okay, kind of weird ones there.
A bit. And then quail showing up from the sea when they needed food. These aren't seen as random things, but as direct divine provisions, more proof of favor.
And the text makes a point that the Egyptians were warned beforehand. This didn't all come out of the blue.
It does emphasize that, yeah, that there were signs and warnings before the big punishments hit. It also adds another layer, highlighting how badly the Egyptians treated the Israelites, calling them beneficent guests, and contrasting this with how, other cultures supposedly treat strangers.
So adding a moral failure aspect to it.
Right. Another reason for the judgment in the text's view.
And one final thing, blindness.
Yeah, it mentions a final punishment of blindness striking the Egyptians, which apparently echoed something that happened earlier, too. And the whole narrative kind of wraps up by stressing this idea of the elements themselves. Earth, air, fire, water working in ever-changing harmony, but always obeying God's commands to protect the Israelites. Unwavering support, essentially.
Wow, okay. So bringing this deep dive toward a close then, we've really looked at these intense contrasts laid out in Judgments and Deliverance in Egypt.
Yeah, definitely.
That stark difference. Crushing darkness for Egyptians, brilliant light for Israelites, the devastating loss of the firstborn for one, versus the sparing and ultimately the deliverance of the other.
Right. And we've seen how the text itself interprets all this, not as just random chance per misfortune, but as very direct consequences, as specific acts of divine intervention, all fitting within a particular historical and, theological story.
It's a really compelling narrative, even if it's, like you said, a very specific interpretation of events.
Yeah.
It presents this picture of just completely opposite destinies.
Yeah.
Judgment and salvation, seen through that one particular lens.
It absolutely does.
And thinking about these accounts, it definitely makes you ponder, doesn't it? These big questions about power, about justice, and about how history gets interpreted, especially when you have such drastically different perspectives presented.
For sure.
I mean, what does it really mean, according to this ancient text, when one group gets this total deliverance while another faces just complete devastation? It's certainly something to think about.
It really is. Leaves you with a lot to mull over.
Oh, thanks for joining us for this deep dive today. It was fascinating.